From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
So they don't really have any strong feelings about the court per se. It's just when the court is a Democratic majority, then it must be activist. And when they lose the majority, it A, either cannot be activist, or B, has to be delegitimized, to the point where we have Ivy League professors at Harvard writing articles that it's okay to ignore a Supreme Court decision.
This is your host, Scot Bertram, and that's Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, the Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. On today's show, an in-depth conversation with Dr. Hanson about two of his recent essays, What the Left Did to Our Country and The Remaking of America. Dr. Hanson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Talking today about a pair of recent essays that you penned at AmericanGreatness.com, one, The Remaking of America, and one, What the Left Did to Our Country, and some similar themes in both. So we'll bounce back and forth a little. But in both essays, you lay the blame for the recent radical revolution in our country at the feet of the Obama administration. Why was President Obama allowed by party members to transform the party in a way that you describe as from its middle-class roots and class concerns into a party of the bi-coastal rich and subsidized poor?
Well, there were certainly long-term trends in the 21st century globalization that had enriched the bi-coastal elite. And the Democratic Party had been an advocate of, basically, to be quite honest, illegal immigration. So we had reached a point, nearly 40 million people who were not born in the United States and were not being assimilated. But those were the long-term trends that were in that direction. But with Barack Obama, that 8-year period, that 8-year tenure accelerated that in a way we never had. And I think the chief legacy is that he took the traditional definition of who was oppressed or who was the oppressor, which was on basically class. And that was what the Democratic Party had always run on, the lunch bucket issues, the United Auto Workers of all different races. And he racialized it. So he talked about his grandmother being afraid of black men. He talked about Skip Gates as iconic of what happens when the police target black men. Trayvon Martin was a son he never had. Then we had the Michelle campaign rhetoric, never been proud of this country, downright mean country, etc. You put it all together, and it was a new message that Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter had not transmitted. But what he was trying to do was say, the problem with our party is that class is mutable, that your grandparents or my grandparents might be of a different class than we are, and we might be a different class than our children. And people go back and forth between middle class, poor, and you never get a permanent oppressed community as you do in Europe or Eastern Europe. And so when you substitute race and you go beyond the 88-12% traditional white-black binary, given the historical pathologies of slavery and Jim Crow, and you'd redefine it in a word white, non-white. And that's the first time we really heard in a long time white rage, white supremacy, white privilege in a collectivized, just stereotype form. Suddenly that constituency of the oppressed grew from 12 to 33%. And then it was completely devoid of class, which helped, and it was permanent. It was you can apparently construct your gender now, but you can't construct your race, and class is, as I said, mutable. So suddenly Oprah was a victim, and Meghan Markle is a victim, and somebody who comes from India who's of the aristocracy and the caste system, because he's not white, he's a victim. And suddenly Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition came alive under Barack Obama. And so he was the representative of the supposed complaints against the majority based on race. And he was trying to teach us that I don't care what you make, my children and Eric Holder's children, to take an example, will always be victims and in need of government assistance or reparatory action.
Around the Obama administration and his two presidential victories, there was this discussion that, by and large, Obama was this blank slate on which people could project their hopes or their dreams. You argue in one of the essays that Joe Biden essentially becomes this facade on which the left can paint their far-left goals and ambitions. How did they achieve that, and why did he allow that to happen to himself?
Well, when they looked at the 2020 cast of characters, and that was Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and on, they saw people far to the left of the traditional Democratic strategy of a guy with a Southern accent, like Al Gore or Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, that could successfully entice the American people into believing the Democratic Party was normal and mainstream. But they didn't see that with any of those people. In fact, the more they heard them on the debate stage, the more they got shocked. So when they started, and then to the shock of the Democratic powers that be, when they went into Iowa and you went into New Hampshire, Joe Biden faded. So suddenly the traditional Democratic constituents say, we've got a problem. Joe Biden is not performing well in the debates. He looks like he's mentally challenged, or I should say cognitively challenged. We've got to back him because he is an alternative to these radicals, and otherwise we're going to get Bernie Sanders and we're going to lose. But more importantly, he's got a facade of old Joe Biden from Scranton, and that is palatable to the American people, especially if we emphasize Donald Trump's eccentricities and et cetera. So Jim Clyburn basically inflated a deflated candidacy in South Carolina with Nevada, and then they promised various people. Pete Buttigieg got his cabinet post. I think they went to Bernie and say, we will go left. They went to Elizabeth Warren. And so they found him very useful because they stocked his entire cabinet and the administrative state that were appointed with Obama people or Hillary left wing. So all of these people now that are running our government, I think, feel closer ideologically to Barack Obama than they do to the old Joe Biden, which no longer exists, if it ever did. So Joe Biden is an empty receptacle, and they put in his agenda, and he offers a facade. And we think, well, he's declining at a geometric rate, not arithmetically, and they think, so what? He's still useful. As long as he can present himself, we can infuse this agenda, and he can be a palatable, as I said, emissary of what otherwise would be seen as a radical agenda. If Cory Booker or Kamala Harris or Bernie was the iconic missionary of this agenda, but it's just as radical as Elizabeth Warren or Bernie's, but it's packaged by an old familiar face.
You point out in both pieces that judges now, traditionalist justices, judges who make quote-unquote controversial decisions, are certain to be met with backlash and what amounts to an intimidation campaign from special interests, from individuals, from senators. The left has also talked openly about packing courts or simply ignoring rulings at some point. Is the goal of the left to take total control of the judicial branch once again, or simply to delegitimize it to the point where it is eliminated from our system of checks and balances, that no one pays attention to what happens over there?
I don't think they have a consistent policy. So it's analogous to the Senate filibuster. When they're in the majority, they hate it. When they're minority, when they were in the majority and Barack Obama used it to filibuster Judge Alito, then it was wonderful. When he was in the minority, his party, then it was a racist Jim Crow relic. Same thing with the blue wall. The Electoral College is wonderful because every time we start an election, you had New York and you had Illinois and you had Michigan and Wisconsin and California in the bag. And when Trump destroyed the blue wall, then all of a sudden, from 2016 on, the blue wall. And I could go on. But as long as they had the Warren Court, they loved the idea that they could get around a tardy, ossified, calcified legislature, Congress, by these court rulings. So then they began under the Nixon administration, the George W. Bush. Part of it was just the accidents of longevity and sort of the arrogance of a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whatever the menu was. They lost control of the court. So suddenly what they had championed as an activist court was activist, but it was activist in the wrong way. And so they began, you had Chuck Schumer at the doors with a mob saying, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, you've sowed the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind, you're not going to know what's going to hit you. If Trump had said that, or any Republican, that would be considered judicial interference. They swarmed the judges' homes. We had a potential assassin show up at Justice Kavanaugh's home. We have a series of hit pieces, minor, no news of any value about Clarence Thomas, but they apply a very different standard than they would to Justice Brennan or something. So they're trying to destroy them in the media. And then, as you said, they look for the process. So all of a sudden, in American history, the word court packing is something we don't talk about because it's a black day in the history of the United States. It's 1937 effort by FDR was his worst moment of his presidency. That's not me saying it. That's people like Theodore Schlesinger and all the great historians of the presidency. And suddenly that's been rehabilitated, that's new, that we can need 15 judges and we need to get 6 liberal judges right away. That's kind of a magic number because that'll give you the what's necessary. So they don't really have any strong feelings about the court per se. It's just when the court is a Democratic majority, then it must be activist. And when they lose the majority, it A, either cannot be activist, or B, has to be delegitimized to the point where you have Ivy League professors at Harvard writing articles that it's okay to ignore a Supreme Court decision.
Talking with Victor Davis Hanson about his recent essays at AmericanGreatness.com. You can also find him writing at VictorHanson.com. Polling shows that Americans believe race relations have hit a 50-year low. Gallup in 2013, about 70% said they were very good, somewhat good. Now it's around 35%. Yes. How did the left reverse decades of progress on this question so quickly?
Well, they did what they said had been the problem with American racism, and that their grandfathers in the party had claimed that they were going to end, and that is stereotype collectivization of a person based on race. That, in other words, your race should be incidental to who you are, not essential. They told us that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of the content of our character rather than the color of our skin was what the Democratic Party was promoting. But they found out that when they created an equality of opportunity in the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Act, they did not get the instant parity that they thought because of long-term cultural differences or economic differences, or challenges is a better word perhaps. And so they went to an equality of result agenda. And that meant that they envisioned the pie as limited, and for each person that got something, somebody had to give up something. So they started to collectivize people. And all of a sudden we started to hear not an individual conservative who was white or liberal, it was white privilege. And then we ended up with Mark Milley and Lloyd Austin talking about white rage. And that struck a lot of people as unfair because they would say to themselves, what does a forklift driver in Dayton, nobody's family has ever gone to college, he's making $12 an hour, sort of the Anthony Oliver Richmond from Richmond, north of Richmond stereotype. What privilege does he have compared to LeBron James? So they pushed back at that, and people got very angry. And I think now, I guess what I'm saying is it's like nuclear proliferation. If a country goes nuclear, then the next countries go nuclear. And that's what tribalism is. So the left said, we want these permanent oppressed constituencies to justify more repertory and redistributive policies, and they're going to be permanent victims, and we're going to identify by race first and Americanism second. And we're the only people who are going to do that. Well, that doesn't work that way. So then all of a sudden people said, if there's a black caucus, a Latino caucus, if there's segregated dorms, if there's segregated graduations, if there's segregated theme houses, if there's segregated space, I don't like that. And so what we're starting to see now is that there's a pushback from the white community, the Latino community, and everybody is saying, I'm going to re-tribalize for my own protection. If it's going to be a Hobbesian war of everybody against everybody, and that's what the left seems to want. And so what they didn't count on is they kept talking about demography is destiny, or the new Democrat. I'm just quoting titles of books that were written, the new Democratic majority. So they pounded into our brains race. And then when people like Tucker Carlson said, look what they're doing, they attacked him and said, well, he believes in the Great Replacement theory. But no, the Great Replacement theory is just an accurate description of demography as destiny and the new Democratic minority. And now they're upset because they've created a Frankensteinian monster, and it's turning on them because the country is 67% white. And whether they like it or not, if that were to solidify, and it's starting to, when you look at the white male voter, it's just they've lost that voter. And so then they need higher and higher proportions of black and Latinos, which means they have to go into reparations and all this other stuff and get more and more radical. And they're in a doom loop that the more they appeal to special interest racial groups to make up for the lack of majority of the white working class, the more they lose the white working class.
Almost the entirety of legacy media, mainstream media, has become extensions of the Democratic Party campaign outlets for their candidates. Why has that incentive structure changed for so much of journalism? Why are they afraid of a good story?
Well, I think you could always make the argument that because journalism drew, for some of its marquee people came out of the university's journalism departments, that it was going to be inherently liberal in the sense of academia is liberal. And there was something about it that it was contrarian against the power, so to speak. But when Donald Trump was elected, journalists thought that this represented a novel existential threat. So for the first time in my lifetime, this was not a Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor reaction to him. This was Jim Rutenberg in the New York Times saying, we've got to abandon the old so-called disinterested journal. This guy is dangerous. It was Christian Amanpour saying on CNN, he's going to destroy the planet. It was Jorge Ramos at Univision saying, I don't want to be disinterested, not with this guy. And then when you had disinterested groups that monitored media coverage, such as Harvard Center, what did they find out for the first time? That 75% and up to 85% of all coverage of Donald Trump in the first 6 months was negative, and that had vastly exceeded Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, 45%, 35%. So we're into new territory where this, and I don't have the answer. If you were going to ask me, and you probably were just going to ask me, so I'm preempting you, was this premeditated in conjunction with the Democratic Party? Did the Democratic Party say, look, we can't defeat this monstrosity. You guys have to just give up all pretense and join us as you have, but you have to give up all pretense. Or was it they volunteered to do this? But it's not journalism as we once knew it.
As you note in your essay, this idea of modern monetary theory, modern economic theory, that debt is nothing more than an accounting problem. You can print what you want, spend what you want, and it's not an issue. And it can be leveraged at that point to promote the causes of social justice or to hand out money to various groups or causes. We heard when Obama was in office, we're all Keynesians now. Are we all modern monetary theorists now? Both parties agreed to a debt limit agreement that has increased the debt by something like $2.5 trillion over the past couple of months.
Well, why they use the adjective modern, they go beyond Keynesian economics, because Keynesian economics works within identifiable historic boundary lines. There's deficits, there's surpluses. Deficit spending will increase supposedly government deficit spending increases demand, et cetera, or spending. But modern monetary theory starts with the idea that, as you said, it's an accounting gimmick and it's finite. Here's the amount of money, and it's loaded or prejudiced against the average person. So they come up with constructs called surpluses or deficits, but they don't really exist. It's just money. So they have it. And so if we were to run up a huge debt and distribute the money through annual deficits, there is no accounting that says that it's gone or we owe it. We owe it to somebody, and the somebody is the people who've rigged the system. So modern monetary theory says when there is necessary for an intervention to quote unquote, balance the books, you go to people's 401ks and you just say, okay, you've got all this money. We're going to take this amount of money and we'll give you credit for 2 years of Social Security. Or you go to bank accounts over, 10 million, and you call it a wealth tax. And so whether they invest it, they spend it, it doesn't matter. Whatever the money they have, you tax 2% of its existence, even though the money has been taxed before.
Right.
Or you go into the inheritance and you say, I know you accumulated this in your life. I know you paid income tax, but you were somehow dishonest because you have so much more. So we're going to tax it at 40%. So monetary theory says don't worry about giving money to the poor or redistribute. It's always there if you have the political will and the ingenuity to find it. And that's what's kind of scary, because it's essentially a communist or hyper-socialist remedy.
At the end of the most recent essay you wrote, What the Left Did to Our Country, you say the revolution is not so much political as anarchist. What is the benefit of being in power when everything turns into chaos?
Well, we think, probably the Hillsdale community and myself, if I could include myself in it, that they're doing pretty well now in the sense the left still controls the judiciary below the Supreme Court. They have the White House. They have the Senate. They don't think they're doing well because they want to push a much more ambitious agenda through. So they would like to have a permanent majority in the House and Senate and a permanent presidency. And to get that, they need a sense of chaos or crisis where people have to intervene. So I'll just give you a couple examples. In 2009, when Barack Obama was elected, we forget that the Bush economic meltdown occurred in September of 2008. We had an election in November. So we went from all of September, October, November, December, January. So there were 5 months before Barack Obama came on power. If you look at what we did in that 5 months, we stabilized the monetary system. Rahm Emanuel came in and said, never let a serious crisis go to waste. And suddenly, we were told in January and February we needed these huge debts, these huge deficits. We needed shovel-ready jobs because of this looming crisis that 5 months earlier people like John Taylor and the Bush administration had solved. And then when we go to the COVID, suddenly everything is chaotic, and Gavin Newsom says, well, we're dealing with COVID, but this is an opportunity to make a more progressive capitalism. Or Hillary Clinton says, this is a time when we can get single-payer health care. Or Klaus Schwab writes a book called COVID-19 and the Great Reset. Or Jane Fonda says, thank God for COVID, it ended the Trump administration. So they look at crises and they like this turmoil and conundrum and Sturm und Drang, and then they think in this fear, people will turn to solutions as they did to FDR during the New Deal that they otherwise would never consider. Because they essentially know that their agenda is contrary to human nature. And most people believe in private property. They believe that you should enjoy the fruits of your labors. They believe that people, given human nature in the United States, are pretty generous people. They're philanthropic. They don't need the government to tell them what to do. But take away that sense of security and calmness and have economics, or you have a medieval plague that you can shut down the whole government. And so the reification of that was the 2020 election. So They said COVID is just, it's out of control, and the vaccinations they're starting to weaken, and we've got to go change the way we vote. So all of a sudden, most states were voting 30% absentee. Suddenly they got rid of that term. They said it's not absentee, it's called early voting and mail-in voting. And we need 70%. Okay, because people will die if they have to go to the polls. They'll get COVID. Well, when we went in all these key states to 70%. The rejection rate of votes that didn't match the register's list or incomplete addresses, it soared from 5%, 6%. I should say it descended to 0.3, 0.4. So suddenly you're swarming 2.5 times more votes, and yet just a tenth of them are being rejected. It should have been just the opposite. And then they invented these new terms, ballot harvesting and ballot curing. Oh, you threw out 1,000 votes? Well, we want to know who signed the vote, and we'll call the person up. We have 10 days, and we'll bring them in, supposedly, to cure the ballot. This was all new, but it was a perfect example of the chaos they wanted to enact things that otherwise would have been impossible.
Let me close with this question, following up on that. But in many places, those were not just temporary changes for 2020 and for COVID, but they are now permanent changes in the way that we vote. So how do conservatives, or those Americans who wish to change the regime, work inside the rules of these new election laws in various places across the country?
It's very difficult because, to be frank, the Republican conservative movement starts with the premise that everybody is involved in their job, their family, their church, their community, and politics is one realm of their experience, but it's not holistic. The left doesn't look at it that way. They're lidless eyes. They get up in the morning thinking, I'm going to do something for the cause. They go to bed at night every night and say, I didn't do enough. And so we play by the Marquess of Queensberry rules, and we look at votes, and we assume that the institutions and the customs and traditions are fair. They look at it as obstacles because they're morally superior to everybody, and they're much brighter, and therefore the processes themselves must change, and we don't get that. So we say there's going to be an election, there'll be a little change because of COVID. Okay. Maybe we should bring in 2 more states. We'll consider it, and we'll discuss but we don't try to change the system and whether it's packing the court or the Electoral College or the filibuster or changing the voting laws or they look at fundamental changes, and we don't. So what the Republican conservative movement's got to do, it's got to say, this doesn't work. This Neville Chamberlain, Stanley Baldwin, and we've got to go full Churchillian. We've got to get deterrence. And we're going to go on, we're going to raise money, and we're going, for every state that changed the voting laws, we're going to try to get a mandatory ID. And we're going to go to court, and we're going to flood the zone with lawsuits, and we're going to have to, until we can achieve that return to normalcy that we had for over 200 years, then we're going to have to sue, and we're going to have to ballot harvest and ballot cure. I don't like to say that, but otherwise it's to be defeated and lose the country because of some archaic sense of fair play, and they don't. And the Republicans at the national level, as I wrote, have lost 7 out of the last 8 popular votes. And they haven't won 51% of a vote since George H.W. Bush did in 1988 against Mike DeCock. So I asked myself, why is that? Well, the reason was that they got this guy they got out of the closet named Lee Atwater, and they unleashed him. And Michael Dukakis was a very left-wing but nice person, but complete facade. He was almost a neo-socialist, but he was running on competence, not politics. And when Lee Atwater got done with him, with the tank commercial, the Willie Horton commercial, the Boston Dirty Harbor commercial, and they destroyed him. And Bush won the last time any Republicans won. And after that, they were horrified. They were horrified that they did that. And Lee Atwater soon died of a brain tumor, and they were done with him. And they said, we're never going to do that again. So George H.W. Bush ran as you remember, for re-election in 92. Ross Perot heard him. He got creamed. And then we ran Bob Dole, who was a very good man, and he did not want to campaign the way Bill. He kept saying, why do you keep lying about me? And then we went into 2000. George W. Bush lost the popular vote. We had a little bit of Lee Atwaterism in 2004 when finally Karl Rove said, enough is enough. We're going to swift boat John Kerry, because that's what they're doing. They bring out drunk driving charges against our candidate. And then we sort of said, John McCain said, oh my gosh, the first African-American, I can't do that. And he would actually go to campaign rallies and chastise his host. If you remember, don't say that about Barack Obama. Don't say that. And so we started the Romney, McCain, Dole typology didn't work. Not when you're up against people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and the people behind. And then we got Donald Trump, and he was a complete obnoxious brawler. And he said, I'm going to go tit for tat. He didn't win the popular vote, but he got elected once. And he got more votes in 2020 in a losing cause than any other winning candidate had. So that's where we are. And I hate to say that, but until we can normalize things, the Republican Party can be either a permanent minority party that's praised for losing nobly, or it can save the country from this revolution by winning ugly.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Read these columns at AmericanGreatness.com and find more at VictorHanson.com. Dr. Hanson, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Up next, Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish Department as we begin a conversation on the great novel Don Quixote. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to find the show on Facebook. Search for the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Get updates on shows and upcoming guests. We're joined now by Dr. Todd Mack. He is Associate Professor of Spanish and Spanish Chair at Hillsdale College. Dr. Mack, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We talked way back when people go back in the archives. It's like the 5th show or something. We talked a little about Don Quixote. And it was in relation to social media, I think, at that point. So we're going to take this opportunity to take a much deeper dive into what is considered the first modern novel, Don Quixote. So let's start right there. It is considered the first modern novel. So what makes Don Quixote a modern one? What was different about it than what came before it?
It's a really good question. You kind of have to define in some way what is a novel, which is actually way harder than than it seems. It's the kind of thing that when you look at one, you know what you're looking at. And when you read one that's not, you also kind of know, but to actually sort of break it into its parts is kind of tricky. We know that novels are written in prose. They tend to have some kind of realism associated with them, although there are also fantasy novels. One of the things that's important that really is brought out in Quixote is this idea of psychological depth. Characters in novels feel like real people, and we have some sense of their inner life. And there's also this idea of a kind of complexity in the way that dialogue works in a novel. That a real novel is sort of full of many voices and different kinds of voices. And we certainly see that in Quixote. Any one of the things that I just said, you could look at something before and say, well, actually, and people do that all the time. And there's lots of debates about what is really the first novel. But if you look at the things that came before Quixote, and then you look at what it is and all the things that come after, it really does kind of seem to be a tipping point in literature to say, it seems like Cervantes is doing something pretty different here that feels really modern. It feels comfortable to read Quixote in the way that it doesn't feel super comfortable maybe for a modern reader to read Canterbury Tales, for example.
The social and historical context, does the reader need that to understand or perhaps appreciate deeper a little bit about what's happening in the novel?
I think you can read Quixote and not know anything about the social context and be okay. I mean, it's really, it touches on so many universal themes. But I think the historical context is interesting. So this is written in 1605, a first part, and then second part in 1615. We'll probably talk about that later. But this early 1600s, it's about the time that Shakespeare is writing his plays. In Spain, it's a really important time because the Habsburgs are in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And early Habsburg, so early 1500s, you get Charles I, who's also Charles V in Spain, and then his son Philip II. These are super, uber powerful monarchs. They really expand the Spanish Empire to where it's the biggest empire the world's ever seen, or one of the biggest empires the world's ever seen. Massive amounts of power. Tons of gold just pouring in from the Americas. And eventually all that kind of reaches a climax with Philip II, and the Spanish Armada then is defeated. And at that point, it's sort of, there's this kind of moment of recognition that Spain has overreached itself. It's just run out of gas. There's no more gold in the coffer. There's no more soldiers to send anywhere. They're really just completely spent. So his son, Philip II's son, Philip III, is, some people, I don't know, might consider him kind of a boring king. He just goes and makes peace with everybody in Europe. It's called the Pax Hispanica. He goes to England. He goes to the Low Countries. He just goes around and makes peace. France. And he says, we're done fighting for a while. Now, his son will then pick that all up again, Philip IV. But at the time that Cervantes is writing, politically things are sort of a little bit more settled. Spain is not in this kind of expansive mode.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's sort of settled down. That's the time when he's right. So when you see the story about this person who yearns for some previous golden age, it's not hard to make historical connections and think, man, things used to be so awesome. And also there is a sense of kind of melancholy and fatigue, especially towards the end of Quixote, that I think kind of plays well in that environment.
Before we talk a little deeper about what happens in the novel, probably should know a little bit about our main character, Don Quixote. Not his real name, of course. Tell us what we need to know about the person driving our novel.
So the novel starts as in some place in La Mancha, whose name I don't really remember, or there's this guy. He's an old guy. He's the kind of guy that keeps old rusty armor in his house, and he eats he's not rich. He's a sort of noble, but not living in any kind of privileged situation. And he loves to read, and he loves to read fantasy novels, essentially, chivalric romances, which were all the rage 50 or 100 years before this.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a long tradition of chivalric literature all throughout Europe, and Spain is no exception. You have Caballero Cifar and Amadís de Gaula, and you have like Tirant Leblanc from Catalonia. So he reads all of these novels, and then the story tells us that because he read so much, his brain's dried up, and he decided, went crazy, and decided that he would be a knight errant, and he would go around sort of solving all the world's problems. And so he does. He gets his old rusty armor, and he puts it on. It's just like his grandfather's armor. It barely stays on him. He has to kind of sort of fashion a faceplate for his helmet. He gets on his old nag, this old bony horse, calls it Rocinante, and he goes out to try to have some adventures. And then he has a bunch of adventures, and along the way he meets up with his neighbor Sancho, and he says, Sancho, you could be my squire. And Sancho's just totally bored. And he says, great, yeah, I'll be your squire. So they go out together then, and they have a bunch of adventures, and so that's who he is.
Sancho Panza doesn't appear until chapter 7, I believe, in the novel. What does he bring to our narrative? How do those characters bring each other out? How do they balance each other in the novel?
There's a lot of kind of different ways to think of them. They are kind of this yin and yang. Quixote is very romantic in some ways. Sancho is very realist.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that Quixote is very delusional. He acts in very delusional ways. Sancho seems kind of really grounded, and yet there are times where their roles flip, and you will find a lot of kind of wisdom and sort of grounded realism from Quixote, and maybe Sancho is getting carried away by things. And so it's not as kind of black and white as it may seem. It's a difficult pair to just break down to some basic dichotomy, and yet they always seem to keep each other in balance in important ways.
Talking with Dr. Todd Mack, Associate Professor of Spanish Chair at Hillsdale, about Don Quixote. 17th century readers who read the novel, and many who read today, find humor, find these adventures to be funny. Where does the source of the humor come from?
This is a very interesting question, kind of like the question about the novel, right?
Yeah.
So,
What's funny? I laugh at it.
right. Well,
funny.
that's really kind of the best definition that we have, is that funny things are the things that we laugh at. To say why something is funny is to kill the funny thing, right? To analyze it, to break it down into its parts, everybody who's ever tried to explain a joke knows that there really is this kind of murder in that process of analysis. And I don't envy anybody who's a humor scholar, because I think it's really challenging. Yeah. In some ways, it's similar to beauty in the sense that beauty is another thing that's really hard to analyze, and yet we kind of know it when we see it, and we respond to it in certain ways. So to say, why is Quixote funny? I think that's challenging. To say, what are the funny things in Quixote? I think that's an easier question to answer. And this is a very funny novel. When I was in college, I had just read Quixote for the first time, and I had a friend who was not studying Spanish. He's a business guy. And he asked me, what's a good translation of Quixote? I told him. So he started reading it, and he called me a couple of days later, and he said, is this supposed to be funny? Because I cannot stop laughing. And it really is. It's very, very funny. That, like, real, honest, just humor. And it's wordplay, and it's slapstick, and it's just all different kinds of things. The absurd, the ridiculous. We self-identify with him at times. We think, oh, that's funny, but it's also kind of, it hurts, but I can laugh at it because it's not me, it's somebody else. Mm-hmm. And so there's all kinds of funny things in the novel. It's supposed to be funny. It's also deeply sad. And that tragedy and comedy, the way that they play off each other, just like the way that Quixote and Sancho play off of each other, it creates this really beautiful kind of balance throughout the novel.
Part 1 of the book contains a number of stories in which our two main characters don't appear. What is Cervantes telling us about stories and storytellers and storytelling in these chapters in which Don Quixote and Sancho Panza don't appear?
And so what happens is they're on this adventure. They end up getting lost in the mountains. They meet some people. They kind of picking up people along the way. Eventually they make it back to this inn. And when they get to the inn, there's this kind of cast of characters, people that we've met earlier in the novel. They're all there together. And somebody finds a sack, and it's full of these books, and says, hey, there's some stuff to read here. Let's read together. Quixote, from the very beginning, Cervantes makes very clear, this is a book about books, and it's a book about reading. The prologue of Don Quixote is astounding. It's really good. It's very funny, and it's all about reading. So he's highlighting throughout the novel different kinds of literature, all the different kinds of poetry, all of the different genres of literature that had appeared before. They all show up in the novel. It's one of the things that makes it this idea that I was talking about before, this like complex interplay of all different kinds of dialogues. It's different people from different stations talking with each other in real dialogue, but it's also different styles of prose and poetry that are all mixed together. So there's all of these different, so one of the reasons why he puts all these stories in is because it allows him to just say, okay, I'm just gonna, it's like the kitchen sink. Everything is gonna get tossed in here, and here's an opportunity for me to throw a bunch of stuff in. I think another reason is because, well, one of the intercalated stories is semi-autobiographical. Cervantes was a soldier. He had fought on the seas. At one point, he was shipwrecked. He was captured in North Africa. He spent some time. And one of the stories seems to kind of tell us a little bit about what an experience like that may have been like.
Mm-hmm.
It serves as kind of like an intermission. The most popular kind of literature at this time was theater. Theater was everything in Spain. It was the most popular form of entertainment. Everyone would go to the theater in these corrales, these kind of open air theaters. It was a huge deal, and it would take all day long to watch a play because they would do an act and then they would have a long intermission. And during the intermission, they would often play a play inside as part of the intermission. They're called entremeses. They're short, kind of one-act plays. Short, may last 30 or 40 minutes. And you watch a whole different play while you're just waiting for the next act of your big play to start. So this idea of slipping stuff in as sort of a break is not totally foreign.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, these intercalated stories, they kind of feel like entremeses to me. And they do, if you look at the stories, many scholars have pointed to the fact that if you look at these stories, it seems like they show they're tiny microcosms of some of the themes that are showing up across the novel.
Dr. Todd Mack, Associate Professor of Spanish and Department Chair of Spanish at Hillsdale College, will actually come back next week and talk more, finish up Book 1, move on to Book 2 in Don Quixote. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Victor Davis Hanson. Find him writing at AmericanGreatness.com and at VictorHanson.com. And Todd Mack from Hillsdale's Spanish Department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.